If you don't want to mysteriously disappear from the face of the earth, there are 3 simple rules you must follow. Rule number 1, never go to a national park. Rule number 2, stay away from berries. And rule number 3, don't wear bright-colored clothes. Don't believe me? Let me tell you a few real stories that will make you think twice. I'm not usually one for spooky tales, but when I received a strange phone call one rainy evening, something inside me told me to listen. The voice on the other end was raspy and urgent, speaking in hushed tones as if afraid of being overheard. It was a former park ranger, or so he claimed, and he had a story to tell me about the national park up north. A story of mysterious disappearances that had been happening for decades. Don't go to the park, he warned. If you value your life, stay away. But of course, being a journalist with a nose for mystery, I couldn't resist the lure of the unknown. I packed my bag, threw in some camping gear, and the next morning, I headed out to the park. The park was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. Ancient trees towered over narrow, winding paths, and a thick mist clung to the ground, weaving through the underbrush like a living thing. I met an old ranger at the entrance, a wiry man with a weathered face and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through the fog. "What brings you here?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm here to investigate the disappearances," I replied. I watched as a shadow of something, fear perhaps, crossed his face. "You should leave," he said, almost pleading. "This place isn't safe. People vanish here and no one knows why. Not really." Ignoring his warning, I ventured deeper into the park. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The air grew colder, and the mist thickened, swirling around me like a cold embrace. It was eerie, but I pressed on. Then I stumbled upon the first clue, a pair of old hiking boots abandoned in the middle of the trail. They were worn and muddy, but otherwise they seemed normal. As I bent down to inspect them, I noticed something odd, a strange symbol carved into the ground beside them. It looked like a spiral, but broken, with jagged lines jutting out at odd angles. My pulse quickened as I snapped a photo. The park ranger's warning echoed in my mind, but curiosity had me in its grip. I continued on, my senses alert to every sound, every shadow that flickered at the edge of my vision. Hours passed, and the mist grew thicker still, until I could barely see my hand in front of my face. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a faint whisper like the rustle of leaves in the wind, only it was words. Soft, indecipherable words that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I followed the sound, moving slowly and cautiously. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, leading me off the path and into the dense underbrush. And then, quite suddenly, I found myself in a small clearing, at the center of which stood a circle of ancient stones, half buried in the earth. The air felt heavy, almost electric, and the whispering grew frantic, as if urging me to leave. But I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from the stones. There was something about them, something that drew me in, like a moth to a flame. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out to touch the nearest stone. The moment my fingers brushed its cold, rough surface, a shock ran through me and I stumbled back, falling to the ground. The whispering stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in on me from all sides. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, tall and dark, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching me with eyes that seemed to glow in the fading light. A wave of fear swept over me, my skin prickling with an icy dread, and I scrambled to my feet, every instinct telling me to get out of there. I didn't know what I'd seen or if I'd really seen anything at all, but I knew with every bit of my being that I needed to leave. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going, just desperate to escape. The mist closed in around me, the trees loomed like giants, and I could feel the forest watching me, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. Finally, I burst out onto the main trail, panting and shaking. The old ranger was waiting there, his expression grim. "I told you to leave," he said quietly. "This park, it's not what it seems. There are things here, things that don't belong in our world." I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me go. It was just a glimpse, a shadow in the mist, but it was enough to unsettle me. I never went back to the park. I never wrote the story. Some mysteries, I decided, are best left unsolved, and sometimes it's better to heed the warnings, to listen to the whispers in the dark. Because some places aren't meant to be found. Growing up in a small, quiet town surrounded by dense forests, I had always heard tales of people disappearing in the woods. The stories were often whispered among the children at school, passed around like a secret. Adults would dismiss them, claiming it was just the imagination of youngsters running wild. But there was one story that stuck with me, one that involved the berry bushes deep in the forest, a place where people seemed to vanish without a trace. When I was old enough, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to find out for myself if the stories were true. I had heard that the disappearances always happened near the berry bushes, where the forest grew thick and the light barely penetrated. It was said that the berries were so tempting that people who saw them couldn't resist picking them, and once they did, they were never seen again. I set out early one morning, determined to reach the berry bushes and see if there was any truth to the tales. The forest was quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under my boots. As I made my way deeper into the woods, a strange feeling settled over me, like the trees were watching, waiting. After what felt like hours, I found them, the berry bushes. They were lush and full, the berries a deep, inviting red. They looked almost too perfect, as if they were calling out to be picked. I stepped closer, my hand reaching out, but then I stopped, remembering the stories. I had heard about old Mr. Wilkins, who went out one day to pick berries for his wife and never came back. And there was little Lucy Thompson, who was just 8 years old when she disappeared while gathering berries with her mother. The more I thought about it, the more stories came to mind. Each one ended the same way. The person was last seen near the berry bushes, and then they were gone. Despite the warnings, I couldn't help myself. The berries looked so ripe, so juicy. I told myself that it was just a story, that there was no reason to be afraid of a few bushes. I reached out and plucked a berry from the branch. It was cool in my hand, the skin smooth and taut. I hesitated for a moment, then popped it into my mouth. It was the sweetest berry I had ever tasted, and before I knew it, I was reaching for another and then another. As I ate, a strange sensation washed over me. The forest seemed to grow quieter, the colors around me fading. I blinked, trying to shake off the feeling, but it only grew stronger. My vision blurred, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the spot. Panic set in, my heart racing. I called out, but my voice sounded distant, muffled, like I was underwater. The forest around me seemed to twist and warp, the trees stretching into strange shapes. Suddenly I saw them. Figures, pale and ghostly, emerging from the trees. They were people, or at least they had been once. Their eyes were hollow, their faces expressionless. They moved slowly, silently, their gazes fixed on me. I recognized some of them, Mr. Wilkins, Lucy Thompson, and others I had only heard about in whispers. They surrounded me, their eyes empty and cold. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, caught in their ghostly grip. The berries I had eaten seemed to pulse inside me, a sickly sweetness that turned my stomach. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The figures faded away, the forest returning to normal. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. The berry bushes were still there, untouched, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I had seen what happened to those who ate the berries, those who couldn't resist their temptation. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was out of the woods and back in town. I never spoke of what I saw, but I knew I would never forget it. The berries were a trap, a lure for the unwary. They promised sweetness, but delivered only darkness. And I knew that someday someone else would hear the stories and decide to see for themselves. They would find the berry bushes and they too would be tempted. And when they reached out to pick that first berry, they would vanish just like the others, leaving behind only whispers in the wind. This time, I knew the stories were true. I never thought much about the warnings. Growing up, we were always told not to wear bright colors in the forest. It sounded ridiculous to me, like one of those old superstitions meant to scare kids. Don't wear red, the old folks would say. The forest doesn't like it. It was one of those things you hear so often you stop questioning it. That is, until my son, Ben, disappeared. It was a warm summer day when we decided to go camping in the woods. Ben was excited, bouncing around with all the energy of an 8-year-old. He wore his favorite bright red shirt, the one with the superhero logo that he insisted on wearing for every adventure. I didn't think anything of it. It was just a shirt after all. We set up our camp near a small clearing. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns on the ground. Ben and his friends were playing hide and seek, darting between the trees, their laughter echoing through the forest. I sat back enjoying the peace and quiet, the kind that only nature can provide. Then, in a moment that seemed both ordinary and surreal, Ben vanished. 1 second he was there, hiding behind a tree, his red shirt a bright spot in the green and brown. The next he was gone. I thought he was playing a trick, trying to scare me. But as the minutes ticked by, my amusement turned to worry. "Ben!" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. There was no answer, just the soft rustle of leaves. I walked over to where I last saw him, expecting to find him crouched behind a tree, giggling. But there was nothing. No sign of him at all. Panic set in. I shouted his name, louder this time, my voice echoing through the forest. The other kids stopped playing, their faces turning pale as they realized Ben was missing. We searched the area, calling out, checking every possible hiding spot. But he wasn't there. It was like he had vanished into thin air. We spent hours looking for him. The sun dipped lower in the sky, the shadows growing long and dark. I was frantic, my mind racing with all the terrible possibilities. Had he wandered off and gotten lost? Had he fallen somewhere? Or worse, had someone taken him? As night fell, a search party was formed. Park rangers, volunteers, even some locals joined in, combing through the forest with flashlights and dogs. I followed them, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes scanning every shadow. The forest felt different now, darker, more menacing. The trees loomed overhead, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out to grab us. The dogs barked and whined, their noses to the ground, but they couldn't find a scent. It was as if Ben had simply disappeared. Then one of the rangers came running over, his face pale. "I found something," he said, leading us to a small clearing deeper in the woods. There in the middle of the clearing was Ben's red shirt, neatly folded on the ground. It was clean, untouched, as if someone had just taken it off and placed it there. My blood ran cold. I knelt down, picking up the shirt, my hands shaking. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints or broken branches. Just the shirt, bright and vivid against the dark earth. "What does it mean?" I whispered, more to myself than to anyone else. No one had an answer. They just stood there, silent and uneasy, the weight of the forest pressing in on us. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Ben. The search continued, but hope was fading. I spent every waking moment in those woods calling his name, searching for any clue, any hint of where he might have gone. But the forest gave up nothing. I began to notice things, small things, things that didn't make sense. Like the way the animals seemed to avoid certain areas or the strange symbols carved into the trees. And then there were the stories, the ones the locals told in hushed tones around the campfire. Stories of people disappearing, always those who wore bright colors. They said the forest didn't like them, that it took them away to a place where no one could find them. I didn't want to believe it, but as the days passed, I couldn't ignore the signs. It was as if the forest itself was hiding something it didn't want us to see. One evening, as the sun was setting, I found myself back at the clearing where we found Ben's shirt. I stood there staring at the spot, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible, carried on the breeze. It sounded like Ben's voice calling out to me from somewhere far away. I turned, straining to hear, my heart pounding. "Ben," I called, my voice shaking. There was no answer, just the rustle of leaves and the soft, mournful sigh of the wind. I never found Ben. I never found out what happened to him, but I knew deep down that the forest had taken him. It had taken him because of that bright red shirt, because he had broken its rules. And now it was keeping him, hiding him away where I could never reach him. I left the forest after that, left the town altogether. I couldn't stay, not knowing that my son was out there somewhere, lost in that endless sea of trees. But sometimes in the quiet of the night, I can still hear his voice whispering to me from the darkness, calling me back to the place where he disappeared. And I wonder if, one day, I'll be able to resist the call.